So I'm Erica Peters, as you just heard, and I'm wearing multiple hats tonight, actually, because I'm on the board of directors of the Asian Culinary Forum, and I'm also the director of the Culinary Historians of Northern California. So if that is what brought you here, welcome as well. And for those of you who don't know, the Asian Culinary Forum is a nonprofit educational organization that presents multidisciplinary educational events and programs to celebrate the rich history and culture of Asian food and drink around the world. ACF President Nancy Freeman and the Executive Director Thi Tran are here as well in the room. So afterwards, you can find me or find them if you'd like to hear more about the Asian Culinary Forum and our different events that we run. And there's a sign-up sheet on the table over there if you want to sign up to get our emails. Also, I really want to thank the JCC of the East Bay for hosting us here tonight, and Samantha Young in particular. You were very, very helpful, and this event could not have happened without your help. And I wanted to say that if you like the food, please visit Shandong Restaurant in Oakland's Chinatown at 10th and Franklin, and Wonder Food Bakery right around the corner on 9th Street. And at the farmers market right here on Shattuck, you can check out the stands of Kashiwasa Farms and Hodo Soy for some of those treats that you enjoyed. So now I will introduce Linda Frank, our moderator tonight, and Linda will introduce the panel. Linda just published her first novel, After the Auction, a historical mystery about the Jewish art world and the theft of cultural treasures by the Nazis during World War II. She's also a board member of the American Jewish Committee in the San Francisco office, and as such, she chaired the Jews in Modern China exhibit that ran at the Presidio in San Francisco from February to May of this year, and that really got us excited for this panel. It really gave us the idea. So thank you very much, Linda. And I hope many of you got to see that show. I wanted to mention that if you have not yet seen the great Shanghai exhibit at the Asian Art Museum, it closes this Sunday, so you still have a chance to go. I'll pass the mic, or you have your own mic, Linda.
Yes.
So you can introduce Ina, Mink, and Dianne Jacob.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? No? Yes? I heard both.
You might have to take that off.
Okay. This is not my forte. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Erica, and I am honored to be here. This came as quite a surprise. I rather thought Jews in Modern China, the whole Shanghai experience was over on May 16th, but thankfully, it led me to meet so many wonderful people and have so many wonderful experiences that I would not have had before without it. And it brought me back tonight to work with Ina, with whom I served on panels throughout the exhibit. And that's really very, very nice. And also to meet Dianne. I know there's that old joke that most of us know that Jews are 5,000 some years old, and the Chinese civilization is 3,000 and some. And what did Jews eat for dinner on Sunday night for 2,000 years in between? I really wasn't raised that way in the Midwest. The Chinese food was, nothing anybody out here would have ever touched, and certainly not in China. But and there is still Jewish food in China, or on its way, because my son lives in Beijing and I mailed him a honey cake today. So, but harking back to, I'm going to talk a little bit about just the history context of where these people and their families lived, and being Jews in China, the context that we learned that because the Chinese government owns the exhibit that we had, we learned that Jews in modern China to them was the definition of 1840 to 1949. And that was the period covered in the exhibit, and that's really the period in which the three waves of Jewish settlement in China were there. Most Jews left somewhere by the end of the 40s because of the Communist Revolution. The first wave of Jewish settlement in Shanghai was the Sephardic, which were the Jews who came from Iraq, some by way of India, and these were names, well-known names that you've probably heard, Kaduri, Sassoon, etc., and the Jacob family. And they came in the 1840s. They were mostly British citizens, and Britain had just won what were known as the Opium Wars. And so they came for various business reasons, including opium, but they stayed. Many of them stayed and really invested in China, particularly in Shanghai, and were very much instrumental in the real estate and business development of the city, as well as other community life. Some were very well connected politically, both with the other international settlers in the international city of Shanghai, and also with Chinese politicians, including Sun Yat-sen. And as well, the Sephardim really founded many of the Jewish institutions, synagogues, schools, etc., that laid the foundation for a Jewish community very much like ours in other places. After that came the Russians, and Inna is a representative of that group. Inna was born in Harbin, I believe, where her family had come to flee the pogroms of Tsarist Russia, just as many of our grandparents left Russia in those years, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, fleeing pogroms. There was another wave of Russian settlement that came after the Communist Revolution, after World War I. And then finally, and it's not really represented here because it's not distinctive, was the wave of, in food that is, the wave of refugees that came from mostly Germany, Austria, and Poland to escape the Holocaust. They came to communities already established. The Russian community established many other institutions in Shanghai and Harbin, schools, synagogues, theater, publications, clubs, and these communities, the Sephardim and the Russians that preceded the refugees, really laid the foundation and the social service, social safety net that could greet the people coming from Europe. Of course, the difference between food and family were Sephardic versus Ashkenazi, the Russians and then the Europeans. Mostly being Ashkenazic from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe and Russia, and Sephardic referring to Jews from Mediterranean areas, Spain, Italy, but the ones who went to China, really the Iraqi area, the Middle Eastern lands, really people who left during the Babylonian exile and stayed until they were cast out of Iraq and moved on. So I'd like to first introduce Dianne, whose family is a Sephardic family, although she calls it Mizrahi, which is the East, and she herself did not live in Shanghai. Her parents did. In some of the slides that we're showing before we sat down were of family occasions in her family. Dianne is a food person. She is the author of a book that is coming into its second printing, has just been reprinted, called Food Rights.
We'll write for food.
We'll write for food. And she's a foodie, and she grew up in a family that came with the Sephardic traditions and also lived in China. And she and Inna are going to talk a little bit about the family life that they know or know of in China. And first, we want to lead off with, did they keep kosher? And what was it like to do so in China?
I came from a very religious family, Orthodox Jews. They had their own tribe. There were about 500 Iraqi families in Shanghai, and a lot of them had come there from India. And a lot of them worked for Mr. Sassoon, who was an opium dealer, and also owned a lot of real estate. And Mr. Sassoon hired clerks from Iraq originally, because they could all speak the same language and they could all observe the Sabbath together. And so that tradition continued in our family, where it was just a huge tribe of people who were always in and out of each other's homes, going to Jewish school together, going to celebrate holidays together, and never eating outside the house unless it was to eat fruit and tofu and bread, pretty much. Never ate in any restaurants.
In his family, as I said, was Russian. Many of them were observant at home, but not necessarily out of the home. And her grandparents came to Harbin in 18-something, and she was born in Harbin, but then was raised in Shanghai, went to Jewish school. Was your home kosher, and what else did you do?
No, our home was not. Can you hear me, by the way, or do I need to take this? Take that. Get it out. I'm also not very handy with these things. Here we go. Got it. Thank you. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. Great. My history is quite different. My grandparents came from Siberia through the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Harbin. When they arrived in Harbin, there was absolutely nothing there that would accommodate the people that came from Russia. There was no plumbing, no running hot and cold water, there were no toilets indoors, nothing. It was strictly a Chinese village, quite small in size, heavily overpopulated. And the group that my grandparents came over was one of the first wave of Russians that were escaping from the communist regime. So my parents were children when they were brought to Harbin and got married in Harbin. And I was born, but I was only there for 2 years when my parents decided that it was too close, there was no possibility of expansion in business, and so they moved on to Shanghai. I was born and raised, excuse me, I keep saying I was born in Shanghai. I'm not. I was born in Harbin, but I was raised in Shanghai. It's become a habit. You know, we want to talk about food today, and a very, very good word for it is they were foodies too, long before they knew what that word meant. I mean, really, the food was spectacular in Shanghai. We had servants in Shanghai. I'm sure you've all heard about that everybody had servants in Shanghai. The cooks that cooked the meals in our kitchen were all trained to cook Russian food. So Chinese food was cooked very, very rarely in the house, and most of the time, if we wanted good Chinese food, we used to go to a restaurant on Bubbling Well that was called the Sanya. Interestingly enough, I found one of the menus that I brought back with me from way back when, and that restaurant was absolutely superb, and everybody sooner or later landed there. It was a landmark. There was another landmark on Bubbling Well Road that was called the Chocolate Shop, and the Chocolate Shop was a place that all the kids that were good got to go with mommy and daddy on Saturday and Sunday. It was the only ice cream place that served American-style ice cream. Sundays, well, you name it. So anyway, these were the two big attractions, and if you talk to any Shanghailander, they all know these two places. The European Jewry that came in and lived in Hongqiu in a ghetto, as you probably have all heard, I'm not going to be redundant about that, had fantastic food. And we went there to eat schnitzel. That was our first introduction to schnitzel. As far as our home was concerned, we did not keep kosher. The only time we were kosher was for the high holy days, when my grandmother used to tear the whole thing apart, cover it all with foil and so forth, and it was a big to-do because we weren't kosher during the year. My parents belonged to a synagogue, and in the days that I was raised, girls were not taught anything about Hebrew or reading the Bible or anything. All you got to do was sit next to your mother. We all had to have allocated seats that had to be paid through membership. Daddy was downstairs, and I sat next to my mother on a chair, and she had her hand on my hand the whole time. And the minute I squirmed, I got a zetz. That's all I remember about going to temple. And of course, there was this continual thing that you would say to your mother, I have to go to the bathroom. And she knew very well that you couldn't possibly be going to the bathroom every 2 minutes because we ran outside in the courtyard and fooled around with the rest of the kids. Food was extremely, extremely important. And I remember so very well that when we hired somebody to come into the kitchen to cook, the first thing you had to know how to do was to cook a proper cutlet. And I don't know whether any of you know what that is, but it basically is a chicken, ground chicken patty that had to be cooked in such a way that when you inserted the fork, juice would come out of it, but it had to be cooked through. So that was an art. And they always tested the incoming cooks into the household by saying, make a cutlet. And then if he didn't do it right, that was it. That was as far as he would go on that.
Diane, did your family have any landmark dishes that was the test for the new cooks?
Well, the cooks made British food, since they were living in a colonial settlement. They made Chinese food, they made Iraqi-Jewish food, Indian Jewish food, and we had there were 4 meals a day. They had usually an American breakfast, and then if they were working, then the servants would bring them tiffin, British lunch, or else they would have a leisurely lunch at home. They would have tea in the afternoon, and that would be Iraqi pastries and fruit. And then later they would have supper, which was usually either Iraqi Indian stews or curries, soups, a light meal.
Going back a little bit to keeping kosher, because your family did your family ever talk about how that was? Did they have their own mashgiachs, their own sheikhs for butchering within the community?
I think I think some relatives were there was a relative around the dairy, there was a relative who was in charge of butchering, and they had everything they wanted, and lots of servants to help them. I mean, I always thought my parents were rich, but what I realized later is that you could be middle class and have a lot of servants.
Right. What about, so your mothers didn't learn to cook? No. I don't know how old your mother was when she came.
I don't know if you saw, there's a picture of my mother in her kitchen in Vancouver, British Columbia. She and my father, when they finally left right before the Communist Revolution in 1949, they didn't know how to make anything. They didn't know how to do anything. They didn't know how to dress themselves. I mean, I'm sure this is familiar, but she told me they existed on matzah and sardines for 3 years.
Not even spaghetti or rice. No. Was that the case with your mother too, Inna?
My mother absolutely did not set foot. She had to have her nails untouched every week. She was not allowed in the kitchen, nor was I. And I must tell you a very quick funny story. I landed in New York when I first came to the States. And I was living in a communal apartment. I don't know if any of you know anything about that, but UNRWA used to take care of the people that were immigrating to the United States that didn't have a bean. And so I proceeded to this communal kitchen and decided I was going to make eggs for breakfast. I'll never forget that as long as I live. I put the eggs in the pot, and I turned on the fire, and there was a big explosion, and there were eggs all over everything, everything. That was my introduction to cooking. I have to tell you one more very quick thing, which was very Shanghai. Crabs were very prevalent, and everybody ate them, and they were absolutely delicious.
Except those who kept kosher.
Except those who kept kosher. The funny thing about that is when people came on public transportation and they were carrying their crabs with them, the crabs were kind of stretched out like that, with bottoms out, and there was a string running through them, but nobody bothered to close their the things that they bite with.
The claws.
So everybody would stay clear of them all through the way home. I never forgot that because I did get caught once and it was very painful.
Keeping kosher has its advantages.
It does. It does.
It's not as painful except for the chickens, although they're not supposed to feel pain. What about holidays? What about holidays?
Holidays were kept in the Jewish tradition, and they were kosher, and everything was done to the nth degree. And my father always attended synagogue, and that was all customary. And we cooked Jewish food.
Just fine.
Russian Jewish food, or what kind?
Regular Jewish food, matzah ball and chicken, and the regular food.
That's pretty much the Ashkenazi. Yeah.
Well, in our house, the holidays were huge events, and I think it was my grandfather who used to wear a top hat, tails, and tennis shoes to Passover and Rosh Hashanah meals. And people were so excited about the holidays because it was when the family all got together and there was lots of celebrating. And the prayers were read in Hebrew, in English, and in Arabic because my grandparents spoke Arabic. My mother's generation spoke English, and what's different about my mother from how you grew up is my mother did have to study Hebrew. After they came home from school, she had Hebrew lessons, and apparently her Hebrew teacher was not a very nice man. He used to beat her on the soles of her feet.
Oh my goodness!
So that her mother couldn't tell.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That would never happen today.
No.
They'd be sued. What was Passover in your house kept kosher too?
Absolutely.
Is that when your grandmother scoured the place?
That's when my grandmother did the whole thing, and it was total turmoil in the household. There's only one other thing that I want to touch since we're talking about food today. I don't know whether you're all aware of it or not, but fresh fruit and fresh vegetables in Shanghai were really a threat to your well-being because they used, forgive me for saying that, human manure to fertilize the fields, and people got deadly ill. So all of that always had to be dipped in some kind of red solution. I think they call it permanganate potash or some darn word like that. Anybody help me out on that?
Potassium permanganate.
Thank you. And all of that had to be dipped, and then it had to be boiled to death, and it wasn't worthwhile eating. And with the same thing with fruit, we actually had to peel all of our fruit. We could never eat fruit where it had no peelings on it. And melons were a disaster because they used to take water out of the Yangtze River and inject it into the melons so you couldn't see it. And people got cholera right and left. So that got eliminated very quickly.
Literally. Did your families enjoy Chinese food? I mean, you've already mentioned you did go out, but to some extent, even keeping kosher, did your families enjoy Chinese food?
Oh, sure. I mean, they were big fans of tofu. You can't go wrong when you're, if you're observant, you could still eat that on the street. And in fact, there was some fried tofu back there, but what they remembered was tofu that had been threaded onto a straw, and they could eat that on the way home. That was their street food. And also roasted chestnuts, roasted sweet potatoes. I don't know, you probably have a long list of all the street foods you could have.
Well, you kind of mentioned it. We had what I call tucks, which you had a sampling of at the back table. We had a lot of different varieties of fruit that was preserved that way. We also had, besides the chestnuts and the hot potatoes, another thing that was very popular was lychee nuts. And another thing was water chestnuts, also done on a straw, and you peeled them off as you worked your way down.
Oh, wow.
And then what about daping and...
And then we had, thank you for reminding me, we had daping isokwe, which was a stand that they had, and they made something that looked like today would be a flat bread with a few sesame seeds on the top. And with it, they served isokwe, which you made a sandwich out of. Very healthy. Deep fried, I mean really deep fried dough that was twisted into a pigtail and you put that in the middle of the flatbread, wrapped it around, and ate it as a sandwich.
I could never understand my relatives going on and on about how fabulous that was.
It was fabulous.
Sounds like so it was a dough sandwich?
It was a dough sandwich. It was hot, and it was wonderful.
I bet.
It was crispy, right?
Yes, the issaquah was crispy.
Yeah. You can still, it's called Chinese donuts now. You can buy it in...
The Taiwan restaurant, dim sum.
Yeah, any place that sells dim sum usually has it.
I've never seen it.
You can cut it up and put it in juk most of the time.
Were there the buns and dumplings and things that we've come to think about as Shanghai food then on the street?
No, not on the street. That was only in restaurants.
Pastry shops,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, we had sensational bakeries. I lived in the French concession part, and we had wonderful Russian bakeries that did terrific things. And as Diane said already, at 4 o'clock we would have tea. That was a customary British thing. And so that's when you went to the bakery and got to choose.
Do you remember going to a bakery and having eclairs? My mother was
Yes,
obsessed about
yes,
eclairs.
Yes.
Yeah?
Sinette had eclairs.
Okay, good.
So that was a French bakery in the French concession.
Yeah, that was actually a very, very fancy restaurant.
Oh.
And they did wonderful things with chestnut cake, which I've never tasted since.
And at school, did kids eat lunch at school, or you came home for lunch?
We came home for lunch, and we had a 2-hour siesta. And in the afternoon, since I was going to a French school, we had what we called pain au chocolat, which was a little, you know what that is? It's a little hard roll with a thick slab of chocolate inside.
Sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
It was.
Did they serve that at the Jewish school? No. The impact of Chinese food on your life and of being in China, your family and yourself, on the way you cook and eat today. Presumably, your mothers learned to cook when they got to this country, or to Canada, because servants were not so overflowing. And what impact did it have on the food you ate then at home? Well, you were married when you came here, but your parents came later. What kind of food did they cook and enjoy when they came here, and what has that passed down to you?
Well, we have cooked mostly Russian-style food and interspersed with American food, but we never cooked Chinese food at home. We just didn't know how.
Diane, your family?
Yeah, we had a pretty bizarre range of food. My mother made Iraqi-Jewish food, which might be a beet stew with dumplings that were made from rice flour filled with meat. My grandmother's version had mint in it. I always hated that when I was a kid. But she also made weird Chinese food that you could never find in a restaurant. And in our family, there was only one kind of restaurant worth going out to when we were growing up, and it was Chinese food once a month. That was it. I ate no other food ever outside the house because they were Chinese immigrants. That's how they identified. That's what they wanted to have. And so my mother would make Chinese food at home that I've never since tasted anywhere. For example, a soup with shiitake mushrooms flavored with anise and vermicelli noodles. Has anyone ever eaten that? No?
No.
Okay. I called it licorice soup when I was a kid. I really didn't like it. It doesn't sound good, right? Soybean sprouts with mung beans, tofu on the table just with soy sauce and green onions.
Cooked or
the Japanese way. Raw. No,
raw.
Just raw. Tons of preserved fruits always in the house. I used to get in trouble when I was a kid for trying to trade those olives that you had back there with kids in the neighborhood, and then their mother would phone my mother and say, "What is this stuff you're trying to pass off on my children?" You know, because no one knew what it was. Yeah, you probably haven't had it before either.
Was that something that they could buy in Vancouver, or your mother made it?
We were in Chinatown almost every weekend. buying, you know. But my mother ate 1,000-year-old eggs, and there was this fish that she liked that was really, really stinky. In fact, we used to call it stinky fish. She would open the container and dip her chopsticks in, and you'd have to run screaming from the house. I mean, if you could have it in Chinatown, it's usually served with ground pork, which isn't how we ate it, obviously.
But you did go out to Chinese restaurants and ate vegetarian or whatever once you got there.
No, they had the Jewish amnesia thing where they had sweet and sour spirits.
They came to the New World.
They came to the New World. No one was looking. Prawns, everything.
Did other members of your family come to Vancouver when they did the larger family?
Yeah, then they had to step it up and go back to being kosher. Okay. My mother used to sit in front of the TV and eat dried fish. There's fish you can buy in Chinatown. They're about this long. She'd sit in front of the TV and crunch on them, stink up the whole front room. It was, you know, in the days where everyone had to gather around the TV so you couldn't escape.
You didn't have one in your room. Once your family, being Mizrahi Sephardic, has your family ever adopted any of the more Russian Ashkenazi dishes like matzo balls or things that were more American, like lax and bagel, that kind of thing?
Matzo balls, chicken soup and matzo balls, that's it.
That's it.
Can I tell my mother's story of making spaghetti for the first time? Okay. So my mother would occasionally decide that she needed to understand Western cooking. So she used to make spaghetti for us, and it was, she would start with maybe a couple pounds of onions and saute them down, add some garlic, and then she would add, she'd never eaten spaghetti, okay, so this was just her sense of what spaghetti was. So then she would add Worcestershire sauce, Tabasco, water, and black pepper. Whoa. And toss the spaghetti in with it, and she would serve that with grilled chicken livers, because that's how you made chicken livers when you were kosher. So I didn't have the real thing until I was in college. When I was graduating from journalism school, we had a spaghetti dinner. And I came home and I said, Mom, you know, spaghetti, it has meatballs, it has oregano and basil in it. She says, oh, it sounds terrible.
Did your mother learn to cook when she came to San Francisco?
After a long, long time. She really did not like the idea of not having the servants around anymore. I actually know of a couple that came to the States that never learned how to cook, resented to have to cook, and when they'd go to the grocery store, I would get a phone call. What does this can mean, and where do I find that? And what do you do with this? And they got so frustrated they went back to Hong Kong, believe it or not. They couldn't handle it.
That's interesting. A Jewish couple.
Jewish couple.
So let's be, you know, I don't know who in the audience is more Ashkenazic, more Sephardic. Let's be kind of specific about some of your holiday dishes. We have the high holidays coming up. What are the traditional dishes in your family and in yours? Why don't you go?
Well, we did the usual thing. We had chopped liver first, we had chopped herring, we had matzo ball soup, then we had chicken, and the chicken came with potatoes or a vegetable or something, and my mother made honey cake. And it was all, you know, very much the same as you would do it here today. The only thing that was different is our normal menu. I mean, we did stuffed cabbage, sweet and sour, that's very Jewish, and cutlet a la Kiev, which is very Russian. We did beef stroganoff. And by the way, at the risk of offending everybody in this room, you guys don't even know what beef stroganoff is in this country. It is horrible. I mean, it is horrible. Beef stroganoff is done with steak meat, cut very, very thin, and you do not cook it to death. You make your gravy first and your mushrooms and your onions, and then you put the meat in at the last minute so that it's tender. It's not a stew. You know, they just have no concept of what beef stroganoff needs to be. And we had borscht, of course, but our borscht was peasant style with cabbage, potatoes, carrots, green pepper, a lot of tomatoes, and always meat. A big piece of meat or 2 pieces of meat were cooked in it.
Sour cream?
And of course, if you're Russian, you can't live without
right.
sour cream.
And kugel and
We
lenses.
didn't,
Yeah.
we didn't have any of that food.
No.
No.
No,
We
and
had-
especially not with the cabbage borscht with meat.
Right.
I made some notes just so I would remember. For Passover, our haroseth is made with date molasses and ground walnuts. For Purim, my great-grandmother would make zangula, which you've never heard of, but you can buy it in Indian bakeries. You take a batter and you swirl it into hot oil, and then it's coated with a syrup in circles.
As opposed to the triangular shape from Haman's hat, from Hamantaschen.
Right, no
You didn't have
No
Hamantaschen.
Hamantaschen. And then the main dish was often mahasha, which is vegetables that are stuffed with rice and minced meat and served with a sweet and sour sauce. It's similar to cabbage rolls, but in our case it was tomatoes and onions and eggplant.
And there was a recipe for something like that in yesterday's New York Times. There
I
was an
saw
article
that.
about Joan Nathan, who's a Jewish
Yeah.
cookbook writer, like you, and she'd interviewed some French people who came from Tunisia and Morocco, and it's one of the recipes sounds very much like that.
But there is some very obscure stuff also that, for example, my auntie used to rhapsodize about this sweet called Baba Khadrasi. It's such a bizarre word. And I just loved hearing her say it. I never knew what it was. So after she died, I inherited an Indian Jewish cookbook, and I made it. And it was it's basically like Turkish delight with pistachio nuts. It was really good.
Okay. What kinds of soups did you have, say, for the holidays? If you didn't have matzo balls, what's the
Murag is the Arabic word for soup, and mostly just tomato, very simple, tomato-based with potato and chicken. Simple.
Interesting. So, how did you adapt? In Shanghai, it was a very international city. Ian has already alluded to the French concession where most of the Russian Jews lived. There was also the international settlement where mostly the Sephardic Jews lived. And there were many Americans, there were Germans, there weren't too many Chinese. Did anybody ever eat Chinese food in the home of a Chinese?
Yes, we did. We did. We had, my father was my dad was a mechanical engineer, and he did business with Chinese companies, and the relationship there was on a business basis. They would come over, and then they would invite us back. In Shanghai, unfortunately, there was no middle class. You either were starving and poor to death, or you were very wealthy, and that really, most of the Chinese people were categorized that way.
There would be people that, there were photos of office mates that my family worked with, but I don't think they went to their house. I think they went out for drinks, dancing, there were lots of parties, that sort of thing, but mostly held in restaurants and ballrooms.
So when the Chinese came to your house, did they eat Russian food?
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely. We never tried to do Chinese food in the house for Chinese people. That wouldn't work.
And what was the reaction of their servants who were Chinese when the Chinese people came for dinner?
You know, they were perfectly comfortable with what they were doing. I mean, I was telling Joyce a little earlier coming in here that we never, since we lived there, and we were a part of the way people lived there, we never did stop to think about the fact that there was a class distinction. We never stopped to think about the fact that we didn't know the names of the servants. They were always called Amma and boy, and that was it. And everybody had an Amma and everybody had a boy. Nobody thought about a name. Just like nobody thought in those days when we walked to school or whatever, and there was a live baby lying on the street wrapped in newspaper, we never thought anything of it because we saw it all the time. It was a way of life.
Oh, I have to tell you this. My mother, when my mother met Russian Jews for the first time, she said, "Oh, it's the first time I ever met any Jews who were poor."
Well, compared to the Kaduri and the Sassoons and the Millers, we were very poor.
They were clueless. They were.
As I said, one adapts to the environment.
During the war, World War II, and by that time the refugees had come from Europe. When they first came, they could live anywhere in Shanghai they could afford. Eventually, I think it was 1943, the Japanese, bowing to their German allies, ghettoized those people. And when Ina spoke about eating the schnitzel, etc., that was later, that was after the war, when she has told me before that Hongqiu was the place she went for good food, music, etc. But during the war, when food was scarce, what do you remember giving up, and did your mother ever talk about what it was like? Well, were your parents interned?
We were not.
Yeah,
we
right.
were completely free. We lived where we were living at that time, and we really didn't have to give up a heck of a lot. We had no fresh oranges. I remember that well because my father drove him crazy. We had no butter, and we had no eggs. And aside from that, and not being able to drive a car because there was no gasoline, we really weren't hurting for anything.
Did you take food to Hongqiu, to the people who were there?
We were not allowed in.
Okay.
That was very different from my family.
Oh, I'm
Very
sure.
different. My father's family, being Iraqi, they were pretty much considered stateless, and they weren't allowed to work. By then, my father's father had died, and they were a big family, and it was just my grandmother, and I understand that it was a very difficult time for them. I think my grandmother ended up selling off all her jewelry and all kinds of things just to make it through that time where nobody could have a job. One of my uncles started a peanut butter business, believe it or not, and ground his own peanut butter and sold it on the street as something that he could do to make money. My mother's side of the family, my grandfather was British because he was born in Bombay, and so therefore they were British subjects. They were not Chinese citizens, so they were interned by the Japanese across the river in Pudong, first in a missionary Christian girls' school, and later in a old tobacco warehouse. And it was all fields then, and now it's a huge, multi-skyscraper piece of property. And they did not have enough to eat. They were starving by the time my mother's family was interned for 5 years, and they ended up eating grains that I think the American government had sent grains to China to help with the famine, and then they had fermented and were full of bugs, and that was what my family ended up eating most of the time. And they ended up eating the bugs for protein because there were too many to try and get them out of the food. And when my mother, this also goes to show you the level of ignorance in our family about about anatomy, for one thing. My mother, for some reason, was larger when she left, and when she left the camp, and my aunt, her sister, was about 80 pounds. And my mother's explanation for why she was larger than when she went in is because she had stopped menstruating, and it was all the blood that had stayed inside her body.
How old?
She was a teenager.
Wow. Ina, you were married, your first marriage.
I got married
there.
just before I left for the States.
What was your wedding like, and what was the food, and where was your wedding?
It was absolutely beautiful. I got married in the synagogue, and then we had a big dinner party at the Didi's Cafe on Avenue Joffre, and it was very festive, and everything was fine.
How many guests did you have?
I don't really remember.
There were probably hundreds, right?
I don't know about hundreds, but maybe 100. I don't think that restaurant held much more than that.
Which synagogue?
We belonged to the synagogue on Route Vallon. I don't remember the name of the synagogue.
Beth Abraham.
I don't remember the name.
Beth Abraham.
We
There were a
had
number of
a
them.
lot of synagogues.
At least three,
A
yeah.
lot of synagogues. There was one on Seymour Road where you guys went.
That's where my
the
family
Sephardic
went.
one.
Ochel Rachel.
Right. And there was ours, then there was one in Honkyu.
Yes, Ohel Moshe.
Right.
And there was Beit Haron was a Sephardic synagogue too.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And that's the one that's. If those of you who were at the exhibit at the Presidio, the architecture looks very much like Temple Emmanuel, that Byzantine 1920s kind of trend. What impact do you think the whole China experience, food-wise, had on your whole families? I mean, your children, you weren't born in China. Were your parents married in China?
Yeah.
Before they came to Canada?
Yeah.
You had children here. Certainly that legacy, that heritage has made an impact. But from the food standpoint, what do you carry with it? What are your families like?
We personally love Chinese food more than anything, and we can eat it every day of the week. It's perfectly okay. It really is. And when we traveled with my husband in 1980, we went back to Shanghai right after they opened the bamboo curtain. The American group that we were traveling with were continually complaining they couldn't stand the breakfast, the lunch wasn't right, the dinner was something else. We gloried in it. It was fabulous.
I'd say the same for
Yeah.
our family. Whenever I travel, I used to seek out Chinatown. I always felt comfortable there. I always knew what everything was. I feel very Asian identified, which I know makes no sense, but I grew up in a house surrounded by Asian furniture, and all my heirlooms are Chinese, and even the ketubah in the photograph is when my parents were married. The marriage certificate is in a Chinese ketubah. So I feel very comfortable always with anything Chinese, particularly food.
Is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to add before we open it up to questions?
I think we've done a pretty good coverage.
I think so too. Okay. Well, I know that these ladies would be happy to take questions, and I can just see.
We have a microphone. We have a microphone.
We have a traveling microphone.
So I'm going to try to bring it to the people who have.
There was a gentleman over here who just stood up.
Okay.
I think was first. It's kind of hard for us to see.
It's so difficult to see from here.
Thank you.
I have made that trip to Shanghai, and one of the reasons I made it because my wife was one of the European Jews that unfortunately had to leave Vienna and move to Shanghai. The Shanghai Jews lived an entirely different life from what you ladies are portraying to me. Number one, if they wanted to go from A to B, they had to go to the Japanese authorities, were issued a badge, and if they didn't subscribe to what they were supposed to do, they'd be thrown into the, what was the name of the? Bridge House jail, and they would never come out of there. They'd die in there. Food was a difficult thing. There was over 300,000, I believe, European Jews in Shanghai.
I think about 20,000.
I think it was a lot more than that, but never mind, numbers are not important at this issue. But the issue was that the Japanese put most of them into a camp, into a ghetto. My wife was lucky, she lived outside of the ghetto, and the people in the ghetto had very little food, and they had a terrible time, and they certainly didn't have the same sentiments about Shanghai as these ladies had. And I would like to ask these ladies, number one, could you go anywhere in Shanghai without permits?
Absolutely.
And were you ever accosted by Japanese soldiers asking for passes or badges?
Never.
The Russian Jews were kind of the only protected ones at that point among the Jews.
We were stateless.
Because they were
They
stateless.
never bothered us, and my father worked all the way through. Nobody stopped him from working or anything.
Well, my wife's father, my wife's sitting here, he worked for the Japanese commander of Shanghai as an interpreter. And they had a fellow there that called himself the King of the Jews. His name was Goya, and he was brutal. Yes. So their life in Shanghai certainly wasn't portrayed the way you girls.
Well,
absolutely
it
know
certainly wasn't great for my mother's side of the family because they were British. They had a thriving export business of linens to the United States, and the Japanese took over the business, closed it down, took all the money out of their bank accounts, and interned my family for 5 years. So it wasn't great for them either.
Yeah, we're certainly well aware of the very different experience that the people who came from Europe to escape Hitler had, and I hope that you did go to the exhibit at the Presidio, where that was really well portrayed. Thank you. Yes?
Do you want to direct
the gentleman with the red shirt.
Woman. It's okay. It's a person with short hair, but that's all right. It happens all the time.
I can't see that well.
I have two questions. I went to high school with a girl named, we were girls then, named Lucille Wallenberg, who was Chinese. And I assumed that she was adopted. But when I met her whole family, they were all Chinese. And they had the name, they took the last name of Wallenberg. Would you have any sense of there being ethnic Chinese Jewish people in Shanghai, or do you think they might have come from Harbin, where there was apparently a Chinese Jewish community for several hundred years?
Actually, that community was Kaifeng, and I've never heard the name Wallenberg. They may have married into a family. The Kaifeng community, which long preceded the Harbin and this wave from 1840 on, was way back the 1200s, 13, 14, 1500s, and Kaifeng was at the end of the Silk Road, at the Chinese end of the Silk Road, and so those Jews, the ones who were really the Chinese Jews, arose from the fact that people came from Europe, Jewish traders came from Europe and married into Chinese families. Wallenberg must be a name they got from somewhere if it comes from them.
I wonder if they used it because maybe they were helped to get out by Wallenberg.
Wallenberg was only in Europe. So most of those families, actually by the time that the Russians and the Sephardim came to Shanghai, that community was somewhat dying out, and in the early 1900s, I know that the Kaifeng community appealed to the Shanghai community for help, financial and otherwise, and it didn't go that far, and I think there was some distrust, that these were really Jews, although it was well documented, but it's a different time. There are still descendants of those Jews who have made Aliyah to Israel, and who, do claim being Jewish. And my husband and I were actually in Kaifeng several years ago, and there's a little old lady, she may be gone now, but I think she's not, who was supposedly the widow of the last Jewish man in China, and you go to her house and there's a mezuzah and various Jewish things, and you sort of wonder if something else was there the day before, but I think that she is credited, if there was a cross of a Christian group came, but there definitely is the history, and Wallenberg, maybe somebody married a Chinese, maybe somebody named Wallenberg married a Chinese person, because they really, I don't think would have had any connection with Budapest, where Wallenberg was during the war, but it's interesting.
I come from an Ashkenazi kind of background, so it was most surprising for me to hear women who don't step into a kitchen, since that was where my mother's life was focused. And so, and her mother, that was like the center of that. So what I wonder is, was there sort of a defined role for Jewish women in China? What was it centered around? What was the focus of that?
Well, my grandmother worked full-time in their business, so, but that was my maternal grandmother. My paternal grandmother played mahjong in the afternoon, because that's what a lot of women did.
Exactly.
And they ruled the household, but there was a cook. So they didn't cook. Now that all changed when they came here, because when they came here, they wanted the food that they grew up eating and knew so well, and they figured out the only way they were going to get it is if they made it. And for my family, it was a way of identifying who they were to themselves and to the world, because there was no one in the Jewish community who understood who they were. I mean, Iraqi Jews from China who ate Indian Jewish food. You know, they had to create their own foods to remember who they were. So they all became big cooks, and they were obsessed with food as a way of identifying themselves to each other and to themselves, and that's where I got my obsession with food.
Your mother?
Dianne. My mother played strictly mahjong every single day of her life, and in the afternoon she went to tea dances. That was it. At night she would come home and change into an evening gown and make sure that I was fed, and then she would go off with my father to a nightclub to be entertained all night long. It was pretty decadent.
And when they wanted, the way they got their clothes was that a tailor would come to the house. They would have French magazines. They would point to the latest Paris fashions, and the tailor would make the clothes, whatever clothes they wanted.
Those days.
Yeah.
You can still have it, but it's the communication's a little different. Yes.
Yeah, Dianne, it seems like your parents influenced their food, especially by Indian food, because they came from India. Because I didn't hear you mentioning a lot of the real Iraqi food, because I'm Iraqi Jew, and my parents, my mom, even though she had in Iraq, she had help and living help actually. A maid used to live there. And they treat her like their own child as well. And she and my grandma, they used to do all the cooking. So
I'm sure we have some foods in common. Did your family eat hamim?
Hamim with chicken, not
with
beef.
Chicken, always.
Yeah, always chicken.
So
and
can I tell
kubba, there is kubba. Yeah.
Well, I described the kubba in the hummus.
But yeah, kubba is with semolina. It's not the way. Also in rice.
In Iraq, it was with semolina, but in China, it was with rice flour.
Well, yeah.
That's what
right.
happened. The foodways changed.
Right. Well, they used to make all different type of kubba.
We should talk afterwards about the food that we have in common.
Sure. Thank you.
I'm curious about the Indian influence on your food.
Yeah.
Well, there was a lot of really spicy. There were lots of Iraqi Jewish food is not necessarily spicy, but we grew up with a lot of lots of spicy slaws and chutneys and sauces. There was a fenugreek sauce that was green called helba. Do you know that one? No, that's Indian. Sorry. And there's chutneys. There was always, my father was always on a quest for the hottest food in the world. He even tried to grow chilies in Canada. Of course, he failed, but.
I heard a report this morning that you should eat chilies with breakfast because it keeps you. There's some sort of appetite suppressant in chilies. This could be the new diet tip of the 21st century. But if you eat it for breakfast, it keeps you less hungry. It keeps you fuller longer before lunch. You don't get as hungry as quickly in the morning. I'm not about to try it.
Hi. I was wondering. I imagine that most of these the foods that that you ate didn't really come from recipes or from cookbooks, but I wonder if you know of anything that has been written down that would be available.
Yeah, Claudia Roden's book on Jewish food has a lot of Iraqi dishes in it, Indian dishes in it. Also, is it Charles Perry? No. I can send you a list.
I was thinking more of the ones that were in Shanghai. You know, the changes in foodways.
Nothing was written down. No, the servants. The servants knew how to cook the food.
And I just wondered if you knew of anybody who had written even articles or anything?
No, it wasn't something that was done in that period at all. There were no cookbooks.
They pass from one generation
Yes.
to another, just like the Torah.
Well, it's like Jewish recipes that I have now. I just wondered if anybody had taken the time to do it.
I do have an Indian Jewish cookbook that's from England. But the recipes are not, I mean, I've tried some of the recipes and questionable. Not a lot of testing going on.
Joyce Goldstein has.
Joyce Goldstein has done Sephardic cookbooks, mostly Mediterranean, but not Iraqi or Indian.
What's that one, Mama something?
Oh, Mama Nazim's Iraqi cuisine. Yeah, I have that. I haven't made anything out of it yet.
The lady in the back that's been waiting.
Yeah, the gentleman.
I want to take a little recess from the culinary back to the political. I had seen a PBS documentary on the Japanese Consul General in Kovna, Lithuania, issued against orders from his government several thousand government in Japan transit visas, to move eastward and escape the Nazis, and they ended up in Shanghai. So I'm guessing or wondering that the East Europeans that escaped the Nazi net were obligated under a treaty with Germany to be interned when they landed in Shanghai.
No, they weren't. They were not interned initially. If they came, and actually the established Jewish communities, the Sephardim and the Russians, helped them. It's like when people came, as refugees here, Russian refugees and others have come, our Jewish communities helped them. And there were apartments, whatever. Those who came with some degree of money, and we were, during the time of the exhibit, we had a panel where Rabbi Alexander was one of the panelists. Many of you may know him. He lives in Danville. He was a rabbi at the B'nai Amunah in San Francisco, which was basically a Shanghai survivors synagogue originally. His family had come. His mother had sown shares of stock, of traded stock, into, I don't know, her coat or into their pillows or something like that they were able to sell, and it was Sassoon, one of the big families had a stock trading company, among other things, and so they and other families like them could live in as nice an apartment as they could afford when they came. But the internment of the Jews from Europe came a couple years later, 1943, when Japan really bowed to Germany's wishes to do something. They would have liked the Japanese to kill all the Jews in Shanghai, probably all the Jews in Shanghai, not just the ones from Europe, but that order ended up applying to European Jews who came after 1937. So they were in Hongqiu for a very miserable couple of years under those internment situations. It was not a concentration camp, but it was a tenement. It was a tenement of Chinese before they got there, and it was an even more crowded tenement after they lived there and after they moved in forcibly. But they weren't. They didn't transfer in as internees. And as a matter of fact, the Japanese consul, whose name escapes me right now, Sugihara, right, the Suju plan, the Fugu plan, among the groups that he helped was the entire yeshiva from Mir, the Mir yeshiva from Lithuania, which came en masse, students, rabbis, whatever, and there was a picture in the exhibit of them studying using the Beit HaHaron, the Sephardic synagogue sanctuary, as their study hall, and they were they left as a group, and there was another man, Dr. Ho Fang Shang, who was in Vienna, who did very much the same thing. He was Chinese, and his daughter, Manly Ho, lives part-time here in San Francisco, and she gave a very good lecture with a couple of survivors this past Sunday at the Asian. She didn't even know for years and years until other people told her that her father had done this. And neither of these people had successful diplomatic careers after that. They were somewhat demoted by their governments.
Well, could you explain, if any, difference between, for example, Iraqi food and Iraqi-Jewish food? And if there is a difference, how would you explain it historically? And the same by analogy for Russian and Russian-Jewish food, if there is a distinction.
It is different because you can go to any country in the world and there will be Jewish food in that country, but it's not the same food. Obviously, it's kosher. That's the biggest difference. What would you say?
The Arabs, they use more lamb, more beef, where the Jews use more chicken, you know.
The recipes themselves?
The recipe?
I don't know. I haven't seen too many just general Iraqi cookbooks to compare them. But for me, it's all mixed up because they were Jews, Iraqi Jews making food in China, so it got mixed up. Like they made an Iraqi stew with bamboo shoots in it, for example. So probably this lady in the front row here is probably a better judge. Yeah. What about Russian?
It's the same thing as what you just said. The Russian food was Russian, and on Jewish holidays we did the traditional Jewish food. But as far as putting bamboo shoots, they put bamboo shoots into beef stroganoff. So I'm very familiar with that.
Another question.
Well, I've been in Shanghai and I've seen Sessonem and the building. I just wonder how many, if any, left in China. Because all I heard is 500 people, Iraqi Jew were there, that's all. I mean, what's happened to all the Jews?
500 families were there.
Family.
And prior to 1949. Now there's about 300 Jewish families in Shanghai, but
they're expatriates, maybe.
Yeah, all who are there for business. You know, there's a Hillel there.
Right.
There's Chabad there.
Chabad has to be Chabad.
Yeah.
And in Beijing there are hundreds or maybe 1,000. There's a very large Israeli ambassadorial staff in Beijing, and a lot of people doing business, and a lot of Israelis doing business as well. And there's Chabad as well as a lay community synagogue, Kehillat Beijing.
Somehow it's a great mystery to me, but when my grandmother was in Hongqiu, she baked her Viennese pastries and took them to the coffee houses. What? And I don't know how she did it. But she all the time...
How'd she get all that butter?
I don't know, but all her letters are about the baking she did, and she made Vanillekipferl and Linzer-Torte and Kugelhupf and the whole things. And she did it in Hongqiu. And I don't know how.
And Helen's grandmother's, Helen Betts, has just published a book about her family's experience in Shanghai with recipes. And her grandmother's letters, passport, etc., were in the exhibit at the Presidio.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
What's the book called?
Oh, well, as a matter of fact,
she has a few.
It's Escaping the Holocaust, and it's my grandmother's letters, and there are a few recipes in the back, but they're Viennese recipes.
And Diane has a few copies of her latest, of her second edition of I Write for Food with her. I'm not as good a promoter. Mine is not related to Shanghai, so next time.
Say it anyway. Say it anyway.
Oh, my book is called After the Auction, and it's about a woman who, it's Holocaust related, who goes to an auction and sees a Seder plate that was her family's that had been looted by the Nazis, and she goes after it. Finds new romance. It's a novel. Yeah. Right.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have one from the crowd. Do you see a hand?
Yes, I see a hand.
I was wondering whether you had any instruction in Chinese in any way, or your parents. You know, people who had to deal with folks from the other culture would naturally just pick up kind of survival Chinese in the ordinary way of things. But I was wondering whether your parents felt that it was important for you to be able to communicate in Chinese.
My father had a factory with 100 employees. He spoke fluent Chinese, and he picked it up just by being there. And frankly, it is not that unusual. Most of us speak some dialect. In Shanghai, we spoke the Shanghainese dialect and many other languages, because we all went to different schools, and some schools taught French and others English and others Japanese. And so most of us that were raised in Shanghai are multilingual.
But many did not learn Chinese. I mean, for instance, your cousins that I don't know, did your mother learn Chinese?
We didn't.
Yeah, my family did
They
too.
did, okay.
Yeah.
But you
didn't,
you didn't have legal instruction in the language. You just learned it because it was around you.
It was conversational Shanghainese and a lot of pidgin.
Pidgin, right.
And which word do you know?
Oh, my parents spoke to me in Arabic and Shanghainese when I was growing up, and mostly what they said to me is, "What are you doing? Hurry up and I'm going to give you a spanking." Tan pico.
Very good.
Perhaps on that note, we will adjourn for the evening. I wanted to thank the panelists so much for what a lively conversation.
Thank you.
And one more time, I want to thank the JCC for hosting us. It was a wonderful night. Thank you. And if you have a moment to sign up for the Asian Culinary Forum email list, we don't send out lots and lots of mailings, just about 4 a year when we have a fun event. So you can learn more about us that way. Thank you so much. Thank you.